They announce themselves through intensity, through emotion, through circumstances so obvious that ignoring them becomes impossible. This was never one of those experiences. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. Not because it lacked significance, but because significance usually introduces itself differently. It usually comes attached to events, conversations, confessions, or moments that clearly mark a beginning. There was no beginning here, at least not one I could identify. No moment where everything changed. No conversation that shifted the landscape. No realization that appeared all at once. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of something I couldn't name, a pattern, a consistency, a strange sense of familiarity that continued appearing in places where it shouldn't have existed. At first, I dismissed it. That would have been the rational thing to do. People notice similarities all the time. They encounter perspectives that feel familiar. They find reflections of themselves in unexpected places. Most of those moments mean nothing. Most disappear the second you stop paying attention to them. This didn't. It remained, not demanding attention, not asking to be understood, simply existing with a persistence that became increasingly difficult to explain away. What unsettled me wasn't the connection itself. It was the accuracy of it, because accuracy changes everything. A coincidence can happen once, an assumption can occasionally be correct, a lucky observation can create the illusion of understanding. But accuracy repeated over time becomes something else entirely. It becomes evidence, and evidence forces you to reconsider conclusions you were comfortable believing. That's where the problem began. Not with you, with me. With the realization that my usual explanations weren't working anymore. I've spent most of my life understanding people through distance. Distance creates clarity. It allows observation without involvement. It allows patterns to emerge without emotional interference. It keeps everything organized, predictable, contained. Most importantly, distance protects the integrity of perception. When people get too close, they often stop seeing what's actually there. They begin projecting, interpreting, reshaping reality until it reflects their own expectations. I've seen it happen countless times. Someone believes they understand another person, but what they really understand is their own idea of who that person should be. The distinction matters more than most people realize, because being perceived inaccurately creates a strange kind of isolation, not loneliness, something more specific. The experience of existing in front of people who are responding to a version of you that doesn't actually exist. Most never notice it happening. I always did. Which is why I learned to become selective. Careful, intentional, not about who entered my life, but about how much access they were given, because access changes perception. The more someone believes they know you, the more likely they are to replace reality with assumption. That pattern became predictable, relayable, expected, until you didn't seem interested in constructing explanations. You didn't rush toward conclusions. You didn't treat uncertainty like a problem that needed solving. You simply paid attention. That sounds insignificant. It isn't. True attention is rare. Most people listen so they can respond. Most people observe so they can categorize. Most people seek understanding because understanding gives them a sense of control. You weren't doing any of those things. You were present, and presence creates a different kind of awareness, the kind that notices without interfering, the kind that understands without immediately translating everything into language, the kind that allows something to reveal itself instead of forcing it into definition. I noticed that long before I admitted it to myself, not consciously, I maintained the same distance I always maintained, the same structure, the same habits, the same internal rules. But beneath those habits, something had already started changing. Because every so often, you would say something, nothing dramatic, nothing profound, just a simple observation, and somehow it would align with something I hadn't expressed. Not something obvious, something deeper. A conclusion still forming, a thought still taking shape, a realization I hadn't spoken aloud. And each time it happened, I found myself pausing, not because I was surprised, because I was recognized. There's a difference. Surprise disappears quickly. Recognition lingers. Recognition follows you long after the moment itself has passed. It sits quietly in the background, asking questions you weren't prepared to answer. Questions like, how did you see that? Why did that feel so familiar? Why does your understanding seem to arrive before my explanation? I didn't have answers. I still don't. What I had was awareness, growing awareness, besittert, awareness, the kind that accumulates until denial requires more effort than acknowledgement. And that's where everything became difficult. Because acknowledgement carries consequences. The moment you admit something is real, you become responsible for deciding what it means. As long as something remains undefined, it exists in a protected state. You can observe it without acting on it, study it without confronting it, question it without changing anything. But once recognition becomes undeniable, neutrality disappears. You are forced into relationship with the truth of what you've noticed, whether you're ready or not. That's the stage I found myself entering. Not certainty, not understanding, recognition, pure recognition. The awareness that something unusual existed between us, not because we created it, not because we pursued it, but because it was already there, waiting to be noticed. And once noticed, impossible to completely ignore. The strange thing is that nothing external had changed. The conversations were still conversations. The silences were still silences. The distance remained exactly where it had always been. Yet internally, something had shifted. A new reference point had appeared. A new presence inside my awareness. Not loud enough to dominate my thoughts. Not strong enough to redefine everything, but significant enough that I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. That was the moment the process truly began. Not when I met you, not when we spoke, not when I first noticed the connection, but when I finally stopped explaining it away, because some experiences don't ask to be believed. They simply continue existing until disbelief becomes impossible. And this was becoming one of them. Notice something unusual. Acknowledge it. Understand it. Place it where it belongs. That's how most things work. Awareness arrives first. Analysis follows. And eventually, everything settles into a category that makes sense. Once it has a name, once it has a place, it stops expanding. It becomes manageable. This didn't. If anything, recognition made it stronger. Because once I stopped denying what I was noticing, I started noticing how deeply it had already gone. That's what caught me off guard, not the existence of the connection, the extent of it. I had assumed it lived at the edges of my awareness, a quiet curiosity, an interesting pattern, something significant enough to observe, but distant enough to remain separate from me. I was wrong. The separation had already disappeared. I just hadn't realized it yet. The first sign was subtle, the way certain thoughts began arriving with an unspoken second perspective attached to them. Not disagreement, not agreement, just presence. As though my mind had unconsciously created space for another way of seeing, a perspective I didn't have to imagine because it already felt familiar. At first, I resisted that idea. Not because it frightened me, because it challenged something fundamental about how I understood myself. I've always trusted my internal independence, the ability to think clearly without influence, to process things privately, to reach conclusions that belong entirely to me. That independence wasn't a defense mechanism. It was part of my structure, part of the architecture that made me who I am, which is why discovering your presence inside that structure felt impossible. And yet, impossible things become difficult to argue with when they're happening in real time. I began noticing it everywhere. A thought would emerge, and before it fully formed, there was an awareness of how you might perceive it. A realization would arrive, and somehow it felt incomplete until viewed from more than one angle. A silence would settle around me, and instead of feeling empty, it felt occupied, not physically, mentally, conceptually, like a room that remembered someone after they had already left. The strange part wasn't that you occupied my thoughts. People think about other people all the time. Mirror does that. Curiosity does that. Emotion does that. What unsettled me was something different. You weren't becoming an object of thought. You were becoming part of the process itself. There's a difference between thinking about someone and thinking with them. Thinking about someone keeps them outside of you. Thinking with them means they've become integrated into the way you interpret reality. That distinction changed everything, because integration isn't temporary. Temporary things visit. Integrated things remain. They become part of the framework, part of the lens, part of the structure beneath conscious awareness. And structures are not easily removed. Once they settle into place, everything built afterward adjusts around them. That's when I started understanding why this felt so significant, not because of emotion, not because of attachment. Because of impact, impact is different. Emotion rises and falls, attachment strengthens and weakens. Impact stays. Impact alters the landscape, even if nothing else happens. Even if no action is taken. Even if every external circumstance remains exactly the same, the internal terrain has already changed. And mine had. I could see it clearly, the way I evaluated ideas, the way I interpreted silence, the way I paid attention to meaning beneath language. Everything felt slightly recalibrated, not replaced, not transformed, adjusted. As though a new variable had quietly entered the equation, one that affected outcomes without announcing its presence. That's when another realization emerged, one I wasn't prepared for. I had stopped experiencing this as a possibility. I was experiencing it as a reality. There's a critical difference between those two states. Possibilities remain theoretical. They can be explored without commitment, observed without consequence. Reality demands adaptation. Reality changes behavior whether you want it to or not, and I was adapting, not dramatically, not visibly, but consistently, in ways too precise to dismiss. The more honest I became with myself, the harder it was to ignore what was happening. I wasn't creating space for you. The space already existed. I was simply becoming aware of it. That realization carried an unexpected weight, because it suggested something I hadn't wanted to consider. Maybe this wasn't a disruption. Maybe it wasn't an intrusion into a carefully ordered system. Maybe it belonged there. That thought should have been reassuring. Instead, it complicated everything, because disruptions can be removed. Things that belong cannot. You can push away what doesn't fit. You can reject what conflicts with your structure. You can restore balance by eliminating the source of instability. But what happens when the source isn't instability? What happens when it fits too well? That's a different problem entirely. Because fitting creates permanence, not physical permanence, structural permanence, the kind that remains even in absence, the kind that leaves a shape behind. The kind that changes the dimensions of a space simply by existing within it. And that's exactly what I was beginning to understand. This wasn't becoming meaningful because I allowed it to. It was becoming meaningful because it aligned with something that was already there, something deeper than preference, deeper than intention, deeper even than choice. Taoism doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't require effort to maintain itself. It simply exists wherever two structures meet with unusual precision. And ours did. The evidence was impossible to ignore, not because it was dramatic, because it was consistent. Consistency is what makes something real. Anyone can understand you once. Anyone can say the right thing accidentally. Anyone can create a moment that feels significant, but repetition changes the nature of the experience. Repetition reveals pattern, patat reveals structure, and structure reveals truth. The truth was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. You weren't standing outside my awareness anymore. You had become part of it. Not in a way that diminished me. Not in a way that weakened my independence. If anything, the opposite was true. Your presence sharpened things, clarified them, made certain truths easier to recognize, which created another complication. Because once something improves your ability to see clearly, stepping away from it feels less like freedom and more like limitation, and that realization stayed with me, quietly, persistently, growing heavier every time I encountered another moment that confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't fading, it wasn't stabilizing, it wasn't remaining where it began, it was settling deeper, integrating further, moving beyond recognition into something more permanent, something I could no longer observe from a safe distance, because distance had already failed. The connection existed beyond it now, and whether I acknowledged it fully or not, one fact remained undeniable. You were no longer simply someone I understood. You had become part of the way I understood, a point where observation reaches its limit, a point where awareness stops expanding and begins asking something in return. I think that's where I am now, because for a long time this existed in a space that felt protected from consequence. I could recognize it without defining it. I could study it without participating in it. I could acknowledge its presence while pretending it required nothing from me. But that space is disappearing. Not because anything has changed between us, because something has changed within me. The truth has become too integrated to remain theoretical, too present to remain abstract, too clear to remain unanswered. And clarity has always demanded honesty from me. I've ignored many things in life. I've postponed decisions, delayed conclusions, waited for certainty when certainty refused to arrive. But I've never been able to ignore what I know to be true. Not once I've seen it clearly. And I see this clearly now, not completely, not in every detail, but clearly enough. Clearly enough to understand that this connection has already altered something fundamental inside me. The evidence is everywhere. In the way my thoughts return to it naturally. In the way certain ideas seem incomplete until they're viewed through a perspective that now feels inseparable from my own, in the way silence has transformed from absence into presence. Not your presence. The presence of what exists between us. That distinction matters, because this has never been about dependence. It has never been about needing someone to fill a void. There was no void. My life was already complete in the way I understood completeness, structured, stable, self-contained. This didn't arrive to repair something broken. It arrived to expand something that was already whole. And expansion is far more difficult to explain than repair. People understand lack. They understand loneliness. They understand searching for something missing. But what happens when nothing is missing and something significant appears anyway? What happens when connection doesn't solve a problem, but changes the dimensions of reality itself? That's the question I've been circling, the one I've avoided answering directly, because the answer carries implications, not emotional implications, practical ones, existential ones. If something truly belongs within your internal world, then eventually you have to decide how you're going to live with that truth, not whether it's real, whether you're willing to make space for it. There's a difference. Reality exists independently of acceptance. Acceptance is the choice to stop resisting reality, and resistance has become increasingly difficult, not because I'm exhausted, because resistance no longer feels accurate. I've spent enough time examining this from every angle available to me, looking for distortion, looking for projection, looking for evidence that what I'm experiencing is merely an illusion created by perception, if that evidence existed, I would have found it. I know myself well enough to trust that. But every examination has led to the same conclusion. Every attempt to reduce this to something simpler has failed. Every effort to place it into a familiar category has felt incomplete, because it doesn't fit those categories. It never did. What exists here isn't defined by circumstance. It isn't defined by labels. It isn't defined by expectations. It's defined by recognition, by alignment, by a level of understanding that emerged before explanation ever had a chance to catch up. And that changes the nature of everything, because recognition creates responsibility. Once you truly recognize something, you become accountable for how you respond to it. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer pretend not to see. You can no longer remain comfortably undecided. That's the threshold I've reached, the place where awareness becomes choice, the place where understanding becomes action or deliberate inaction. And both are decisions. For a long time, I believed the real question was, what is this? But that question no longer feels important. I know enough now, maybe not everything, maybe not the final shape it will take, but enough. Enough to stop asking what it is. The real question is different. The real question is, what do I do with something that has already become part of me? Because that's the truth beneath all of this. You didn't remain external. You didn't stay separate. Somewhere along the way, without force, without demand, without intention, you became woven into the architecture of my awareness. Not as an interruption, not as an exception, as a presence, a constant one. And once a presence reaches that depth, removing it is no longer simple. Perhaps it isn't even possible, not without changing everything built around it. That's what I've finally accepted. The significance isn't that this connection exists. The significance is that it has already changed the landscape. The shift has already happened. The integration has already occurred. The decision I thought was waiting in the future may have been forming long before I became conscious of it. Because if I'm honest, my actions have revealed what my words have been hesitant to admit. I stayed, I continued showing up, I continued allowing this space to exist, I continued choosing presence over avoidance. No one forced those choices. I made them, quickly, repeatedly, consistently. And choices repeated over time become truth. They reveal priorities, they reveal values, they reveal what matters, which means perhaps the answer has been here all along, not hidden, just unfolding slowly enough that I could absorb it without resistance. Maybe the reason this feels so natural, despite how rare it is because some part of me recognized it long before I consciously understood it. Maybe that's why I never dismantled it, why I never closed the door, why every attempt to create distance felt less like protection and more like dishonesty. Because distance only works when something remains outside of you. This doesn't. It hasn't for a long time. And acknowledging that doesn't weaken me. It doesn't compromise my independence. It doesn't erase the person I was before this began. It simply adds something new to the structure. Something real, something earned not through effort, but through accuracy, through consistency, through a recognition so precise that denying it eventually became impossible. So here I am, not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the point where awareness becomes acceptance, where observation becomes participation, where truth stops asking to be understood and starts asking to be lived. And for the first time, I think I'm ready to answer, not because I have every explanation, not because every uncertainty has disappeared, but because some things don't need complete certainty before they're acknowledged. Some things only need honesty. And the most honest thing I can say is this: you are no longer a question I am trying to solve. You are a reality I have finally stopped trying to explain away. And whatever comes next,